Good afternoon. This afternoon I'm going to be reading the 12th letter of 14. This afternoon I'm going to be reading the 12th letter of 14 in The New God Image by Edward Edinger. These are 14 letters that C.G. Jung wrote to various people during his long career, and I just want to get my image somewhat straightened up here. Okay, and these letters really explain what Dr. Jung was thinking in terms of the fact that he found the living God within the psyche. And so one of his most important relationships was that with Father Victor White, who was a Dominican father, and he was professor of dogmatic studies at the Dominican House Blackfriars at Oxford University. And he had had a certain midlife crisis in 1940, and he happened to have gone to a Jungian analyst at that time who helped him through his crisis, and therefore he came to know of Dr. Jung's thought. And when the war was over in 1945, he approached Dr. Jung with some of his own writing, which was bringing together theological thinking and psychology. And so they had a long correspondence, about over 10 years, and they collaborated very heavily. Father White came to Bollingen several times for holiday and to share things directly with Dr. Jung. And in Dr. Jung's second letter to Victor White, he set forth the goal of his whole work in terms of religion. And that goal is here on the screen for you. It is of the highest importance that the educated and enlightened public should know religious truth as a thing living in the human soul, and not as an abstruse and unreasonable relic of the past. And so Dr. Jung's work was really an answer to Friedrich Nietzsche's statement that God is dead. And so this morning I read the first of two letters, which appear in Edward Edinger's The New God Image by Edward Edinger. And I'm reading from page 153. And this is a letter that Dr. Jung wrote to Victor White about 6 months later than the letter that I read this morning. And so I will begin, and I will look for comments or questions as we go forward. Dear Victor, 10 April 1954. I am puzzled about your conception of Christ, and I try to understand it. It looks to me as if you are mixing up the idea of Christ being human and being divine. Inasmuch as he is divine, he knows, of course, everything, because all things macrocosmic are supposed to be microcosmic as well, and can therefore be said to be known by the self. Things, moreover, behave as if they were known. It is an astonishing fact, indeed, that the collective unconscious seems to be in contact with nearly everything. There is, of course, no empirical evidence for such a generalization, but plenty of it for its indefinite extension. The sententia, therefore animum Christi nihil ignorabis, I better translate that quote. Okay, the footnote says, Christ's soul was not ignorant of anything. This and the following, from the beginning he knew everything, are two statements of the Holy Roman Office, one of the 11 departments of the Roman Curia, laid down in 1918 and quoted by White. And so what Dr. Jung is saying is, there is, of course, no empirical evidence for such a generalization, but plenty of it for its indefinite extension. The sententia, therefore, animam Christi nihil ignoravis, is not contradicted by psychological experience. Christ as the self can be said to have known everything from the beginning. I should say that Christ knew his shadow, Satan, whom he cut off from himself right at the beginning of his career. The self is a unit, consisting, however, of two, i.e., of opponents. Otherwise, it would not be a totality. Christ has consciously divorced himself from his shadow. Inasmuch as he is divine, he is the self, yet only its white half. Inasmuch as he is human, he has never lost his shadow completely, but seems to have been conscious of it. How could he say otherwise, "Do not call me good"? The citations for that are Matthew 19:17, Mark 10:18, and Luke 18:19. How could he say otherwise, "Do not call me good"? It is also reasonable to believe that as a human, he was not wholly conscious of it, and inasmuch as he was unconscious, he projected it indubitably. The split, and inasmuch as he was unconscious, he projected it indubitably. The split through his self made him as a human being as good as possible, although he was unable to reach the degree of perfection his white self already possessed. The Catholic doctrine cannot but declare that Christ, even as a human being, knew everything. This is the logical consequence of the perfect union of the dua naturae. Christ as understood by the Church is to me a spiritual, i.e., mythological being. Even his humanity is divine, as it is generated by the Celestial Father and exempt from original sin. When I speak of him as a human being, I mean its few traces we can gather from the Gospels. It is not enough for the reconstruction of an empirical character. It is not enough for the reconstruction of an empirical character. Moreover, even if we could reconstruct an individual personality, it would not fulfill the role of Redeemer and God-man, who is identical with the all-knowing self. Since the individual human being is characterized by a selection of tendencies and qualities, it is a specification and not a wholeness, i.e., It cannot be individual without incompleteness and restriction, whereas the Christ of the doctrine is perfect, complete, whole, and therefore not individual at all, but a collective mythologem, that is, an archetype. He is far more divine than human, and far more universal than individual. Concerning the omniscience, it is important to know that Adam already was equipped with supernatural knowledge according to Jewish and Christian tradition, all the more so Christ. I think that the great split in those days was by no means a mistake, but a very important collective fact of synchronistic correspondence with the then new eon of Pisces. Archetypes, in spite of their conservative nature, are not static, but in a continuous dramatic flux. Thus, the self as a monad or continuous unit would be dead, but it lives inasmuch as it splits and unites again. There is no energy without opposites. All conservatives and institutionalists are Pharisees, if you apply this name without prejudice. All conservatives and institutionalists are Pharisees, if you apply this name without prejudice. Thus it was to be expected that just the better part of Jewry would be hurt most by the revelation of an exclusively good God and loving Father. This novelty emphasized with disagreeable clearness that the Yahweh hitherto worshipped had some additional, less decorous propensities. For obvious reasons, the Orthodox Pharisees could not defend their creed by insisting on the bad qualities of their God. Christ, with his teaching of an exclusively good God, must have been most awkward for them. They probably believed him to be hypocritical, since this was his main objection against them. One gets that way when one has to hold on to something which once has been good and had meant considerable progress or improvement at the same time. It was an enormous step forward when Yahweh revealed himself as a jealous God, letting his chosen people feel that he was after them with blessings and with punishments, and that God's goal was man. Not knowing better, they cheated him by obeying his law literally. But as Job discovered Yahweh's primitive immorality, God found out about the trick of observing the law and swallowing camels. The old popes and bishops succeeded in getting so much heathendom, barbarism, and real evil out of the church that it became much better than some centuries before. There were no Alexander VI, no auto de fes, no thumbscrews and racks anymore, so that the compensatory drastic virtues, asceticism, etc., lost their meaning to a certain extent. The great split, having been a merely spiritual fact for a long time, has at last got into the world as a rule in its coarsest and least recognizable form, that is, as the Iron Curtain. The completion of the second fish. Now a new synthesis must begin, but how can absolute evil be connected and identified with absolute good? It seems to be impossible. When Christ withstood Satan's temptation, That was the fatal moment when the shadow was cut off. Yet it had to be cut off in order to enable man to become morally conscious. If the moral opposites could be united at all, they would be suspended together and there could be no morality at all. That is certainly not what synthesis aims at. In such a case of irreconcilability, the opposites are united by a neutral and ambivalent bridge, a symbol expressing either side in such a way that they can function together. This symbol is the cross as interpreted of old, that is, the tree of life, or simply as the tree to which Christ is inescapably affixed. This particular feature points to the compensatory significance of the tree. The tree symbolizes that entity from which Christ had been separated and with which he ought to be connected again to make his life or his being complete. In other words, the crucifixus is the symbol uniting the absolute moral opposites. Christ represents the light, the tree, the darkness. He the son, it the mother. Both are androgynous. Tree equals phallus. Christ is so much identical with the cross that both terms have become almost interchangeable in ecclesiastical language. For instance, redeemed through Christ or through the cross, etc. The tree brings back all that has been lost through Christ's extreme spiritualization, namely the elements of nature. Through its branches and leaves, the tree gathers the powers of light and air, and through its roots, those of earth and water. Christ was suffering on account of his split, and he recovers his perfect life at Easter when he is buried again in the womb of the Virginal Mother, represented also in the myth of Attis by the tree, to which an image of Attis was nailed, then cut down and carried into the cave of the mother Kibble. The Nativity Church of Bethlehem is erected over an Attis sanctuary. This mythical complex seems to represent a further development of the old drama, existence becoming real through reflection in consciousness, Job's tragedy. But now it is the problem of dealing with the results of conscious discrimination. The first attempt is moral appreciation and decision for the good. Although this decision is indispensable, it is not too good in the long run. You must not get stuck with it, otherwise you grow out of life and die slowly. Then the one-sided emphasis on the good becomes doubtful, but there is apparently no possibility of reconciling good and evil. That is where we are now. The symbolic history of the Christ life shows as the essential teleological tendency the crucifixion, that is, the union of Christ with the symbol of the tree. It is no longer a matter of an impossible reconciliation of good and evil, but of man with his vegetative equals unconscious life. In the case of the Christian symbol, the tree, however, is dead and man upon the cross is going to die, i.e., the solution of the problem takes place after death. That is so as far as Christian truth goes. But it is possible that the Christian symbolism expresses man's mental condition in the eon of the Pisces, as the ram and the bull gods do for the ages of Aries and Taurus. In this case, the post-mortal solution would be symbolic of an entirely new psychological status, that is, that of Aquarius, which is certainly a oneness, presumably that of the Anthropos, the realization of Christ's illusion, dir estis. Presumably that of the Anthropos, the realization of Christ's illusion, you are gods. This is a formidable secret and difficult to understand because it means that man will be essentially God and God-man. The signs pointing in this direction consist in the fact that the cosmic power of self-destruction is given into the hands of man, and that man inherits the dual nature of the Father. He will misunderstand it, and he will be tempted to ruin the universal life of the earth by radioactivity. He will misunderstand it, and he will be tempted to ruin the universal life of the earth by radioactivity. Materialism and atheism, the negation of God, are indirect means to attain this goal. Through the negation of God, one becomes deified, i.e., God Almighty-like, and then one knows what is good for mankind. That is how destruction begins. The intellectual schoolmasters of the Kremlin are a classic example. The danger of following the same path is very great indeed. It begins with the lie, i.e., the projection of the shadow. There is need of people knowing about their shadow because there must be somebody who does not project. They ought to be in a visible position where they would be expected to project, and unexpectedly, they do not project. They can thus set a visible example, which would not be seen if they were invisible. There is certainly Phariseeism. There is certainly Phariseeism, law consciousness, power drive, sex obsession, and the wrong kind of formalism in the church. But these things are symptoms that the old showy and easily understandable ways and methods have lost their significance and should be slowly replaced by more meaningful principles. This indeed means trouble with the Christian vices. Since you cannot overthrow a whole world because it harbors also some evil, it will be a more individual or local fight with what you rightly call avidya. It will be a more individual or local fight with what you rightly call avidya. As tout passe, even theological books are not true forever, and even if they expect to be believed, one has to tell them in a loving and fatherly way that they make some mistakes. A true and honest introverted thinking is a grace and possesses for at least a time divine authority, particularly if it is modest, simple, and straight. The people who write such books are not the voice of God. They are only human. It is true that the right kind of thinking isolates oneself. But did you become a monk for the sake of congenial society? Or do you assume that it Or do you assume that it isolates only a theologian? It has done the same to me and will do so to everybody that is blessed with it. That is the reason why there are compensatory functions. The introverted thinker is very much in need of a developed feeling, i.e., a less autoerotic, sentimental, melodramatic, and emotional relatedness to people and things. The compensation will be a hell of a conflict to begin with, but later on, by understanding what nirvana means, they become the pillars at the gate of the transcendent function, i.e., the transitus of the self. Cordially yours, C.G. Jung. Okay, so I'll read the footnotes here. Footnote 1. White wrote a long letter on 3 March 1954 in answer to Jung's of 24 November 1953, expressing agreement with most of what he said. It deals largely with Jung's views on the problem of Christ's shadow, which contradict the Catholic doctrine that Christ knew everything and therefore could not have a shadow. Footnote 2. Jung's commentary on the psychology of the trickster figure, found in Collected Works 9:1, for Paul Radin, the trickster. Karenyi wrote the other commentary. I'm sorry, let me go back and see what that footnote refers to make it easier. Okay, he's talking about, I omitted the first paragraph of this letter because it was rather complicated relating to a specific book. It was a book by Paul Radin and K. Karenyi, and so he's referring to that commentary, Jung's commentary on the psychology of the trickster figure. Okay, so in footnote 4, Christ's soul was not ignorant of anything. This and the following ab initio cognovais omnia, from the beginning he knew everything, are 2 statements of the Holy Roman Office, one of the 11 departments of the Roman Curia, laid down in 1918 and quoted by White. And then we have the footnote for the "You are gods." Is that right? Wait a minute. Oh, the footnote for "Do not call me good," and the footnote is Matthew 19:17, Mark 10:18, and Luke 18:19. And then I think that the great split in those days, what he's referring to as the great split, is the separation of Christ, the epitome of good, from his shadow, the devil. And then on this sentence, but as Job discovered Yahweh's primitive amorality, God found out about the trick of observing the law and swallowing camels. And the footnote to that is Matthew 23:24. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. And then he's talking about the old popes and bishops succeeded in getting so much heathendom, barbarism, and real evil out of the church that it became much better than some centuries before. There were no Alexander VI. And Alexander VI, the footnote is Rodrigo Borgia, 1431 to 1503, the most notorious of the corrupt and venal popes of the Renaissance. Paragraph, let's see. And he's talking about the modern split, the great split having been merely a spiritual fact for a long time, has at last got into the world as a rule in its coarsest and least recognizable form, that is, as the Iron Curtain, the completion of the second fish. And so the footnote is the astrological sign of Pisces consists of two fishes, which were frequently regarded as moving in opposite directions. Traditionally, the reign of Christ corresponds to the first fish and ended with the first millennium, whereas the second fish coincides with the reign of Antichrist, now nearing its end with the entry of the vernal equinox into the sign of Aquarius. And this is mentioned in Ion, collected work 9.2, paragraphs 148 and following, and in Answer to Job, collected works 11, paragraph 725. And he refers to the bridge is the uniting symbol, which represents psychic totality, the self. From Psychological Types, collected work 6, paragraph 828. And there's another one about the tree. The tree often symbolizes the mother and appears as such in the numerous tree birth myths. Symbols of Transformation, collected works 5, part 2, chapter 5. But it is also a phallic symbol and thus has an androgynous character. For Christ's androgyny, see Mysterium Conjunctionis, paragraphs 526, 565, and note 63. Attis was one of the young dying gods, the lover of Kybele, the great mother goddess of Anatolia. In her rites, taking place in March, a pine tree, symbol of Attis, was carried into her sanctuary. Jung's letter to Father White, 25 November 1950, note 5, in Letters 1, page 566. The sanctuary of Adonis, another young dying god closely related to Attis, existed since ancient times in a cave at Bethlehem. It is supposed to be identical with Christ's birthplace, over which Constantine the Great had a basilica built. And the quote, "Ye are gods," is from John 10:34, and the term nirvana is Sanskrit for free from the opposites, love and hate, joy and sorrow, etc. That's from Psychological Types, collected works 6, paragraphs 327 and following. And he's referring to inferior. Okay, so his last sentence where he says, The compensation will be a hell of a conflict to begin with, but later on, by understanding what nirvana means, they become the pillars at the gate of the transcendent function, i.e. the transitants to the self. And where he says they, the footnote reads, here they refers to the compensatory or inferior functions. And he's specifically referring to psychological types, definition number 30. Okay, so that is the second letter to the Reverend the Reverend Father Victor White. If there are any questions or comments, I'll be happy to respond to them. Otherwise, we will take a break until tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, I think I will read something about the White-Jung friendship. And then tomorrow evening, we will have our regular weekly Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group regular meeting, which will be held at Sammy's Italian Pizza Kitchen in Annapolis, Maryland at 8 p.m. You are welcome to attend if you are in the Annapolis area, and but otherwise it will be broadcast through my iPhone, which is not ideal because I cannot watch chat through my iPhone very well. However, I'm going to try to take my iPad with me tomorrow and see if I can't catch the chat on the iPad. And so that will begin tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So I look forward to seeing you then if you're available. I hope so. Anyway, I'm going to discontinue for now. Thank you for joining me today.